Let's look at 4 common deadlift mistakes and how you might be able to fix them. The first one we've got here is up to a 200 kilo deadlift, and generally it's quite a nice deadlift, but the major issue here is his start position and that first pull off the floor, or as soon as the barbell leaves the floor, we're getting dragged forward. So this is primarily coming from 2 different areas. The first is incorrect tension applied in the start position. So he's not holding enough tension in himself. He's not braced enough when he begins pulling. So even though he's getting set up, he's rocking back and he's not in a great position where he's really well balanced. And then as soon as he begins pulling, you can see that barbell actually moves forward off the floor and then his hips shoot up. The second area where this might be coming from is actually just not allowing his hips to stay down. So in the deadlift, if we keep those hips down, generally it keeps the shoulders moving relatively vertically. This generally then will keep the legs engaged. So when we're pulling off the floor, this lets us keep our legs driving primarily from the floor. And then this stops the back being pulled forward or that torso being pulled forward. So we can see as soon as that torso is pulled forward, this does 2 things. This reduces our leg drive, although he does quite a good job to fight against it and try and keep his legs involved, which is kudos to him. Now, if you'd like help with your own strength training, I want to drop myself for just a second. We have put together 30 of our biggest insights and most important insights into strength training. It's in the link below. We'll send you 1 email per day. The open rates are super high. People are loving them. They're north of 60%, which is massive for emails because we put a lot of time and effort into those. And a lot of the questions we get recently, I'm thinking back to that series we created where if you'd read the series, you'd have to answer that question right now and you wouldn't have to wait for me to try and answer it. And then we'll often see that the barbell will be bumped forward or dragged forward because we let it drift forward. So as soon as those hips shoot up initially, if we let the hips dominate the start of the deadlift, we'll often see this issue. So shoulders will move further in front of the barbell, which we don't want. And then what will often happen, because the barbell is very, very heavy, if we get it moving off the floor, that barbell might drift away initially. As soon as the barbell leaves the floor, this is obviously a bad idea because this makes the barbell harder to lift. It's further away from your center of mass. It's harder for you to apply force to it. And then this, as a result, makes that barbell feel heavier than it should be, and you're not able to correctly drive with your legs. Now, the fix for this, there's a couple of ways we can do it. The first thing we need to do in this case is generally actually just become aware of it. So not letting the hips immediately shoot up off the floor. A deadlift cue, the most common one you give people is hips down, chest up. If you can keep your chest up and your hips down, this should eliminate it. However, this might require a few extra variations or other ways of addressing this. One of the ways we could do that is some really slow eccentrics, which he's actually seemed to be doing here, so it might be the best option for him. But in the last portion, what we could do is as we're descending down nice and slowly, we're hovering just above the floor. We're trying to keep that nice hip and chest position. And as soon as he's above the floor, then we're really gently touching it off the floor. Now, this is obviously quite fatiguing, so don't do this super frequently. But slowing down the eccentric and slowing it down all the way, not just as soon as the barbell gets above the floor, is really important because we want to train this position, and eccentrically loading those positions is a good way of reinforcing this. We could also use some pause at the knee. So we're really focused on keeping a really strong position, but then we pause at the knee. For some reason, it gives a lot of lifters a way of psychologically reinforcing this position. Whereas if we think about the full deadlift, often lifters aren't able to keep that position. Now, obviously pausing at the knee as well, a little bit of that isometric is also giving us an option to train our backs a little bit more, put a bit more pressure on our backs, a bit more time under tension, and as a result should make us stronger for that position. So we've got technical issue, and then we've also got some variations that might address that. So when you're lifting, if you see your hips immediately going like this in a seesaw motion, if your hips go up too fast, then that's letting us know that you're reducing your leg drive and the barbell is going to be moving further away from you. One or both of these things might happen. So watch the hips when you're pulling off the floor. See what they do. If you see a major change in your back angle in the deadlift, then there's probably something going wrong and you need to address it. Now here we've got a really common issue, and this is an extreme example of the technique we were just focusing on, but this gentleman is an athlete. I think he is a European handball athlete. We have a handball game in Ireland that's different to that one, but in general this is a deadlift style that a lot of athletes tend towards. This is the one of least resistance. Usually they'll find it harder to keep the drive through their legs, so instead of the knees staying forward, seeing that leg drive continuing, what we'll often see is those knees will shift back really aggressively, and then as a result, of course, if the knees move back too soon when the barbell is too low, what happens to your hips? Your hips rise up too fast, and then your shoulders move in front of the barbell, and we're primarily turning it into a stiff-legged deadlift, which is not what we want. We want the engagement of the legs. Why do athletes do this routinely? Well, this is one that requires the least amount of tension on your legs. It's the one that most people will default to because they won't understand the feeling of keeping the leg drive going, and this is the kind of path of least resistance, but it's not the path to most resistance on the bar. Am I right? Yep, I said that. So we've got, it's super common. It really specifically with kind of field sports athletes, a lot of them will tend towards this. Now, in some cases they'll do this, but they'll do it with 250 kilos, so it's not always the worst thing to do. But in this case, we've got 160 kilos and we really want to work in this. So I'm actually not super mad at deadlifting in the weightlifting shoes. It's not a major issue. Would it be slightly preferable in most cases? Yes. But I actually think I recognize this gym. I think this is in Queen's, is this in Ulster? Queen's University in Ulster? I think a lot of weightlifting Ireland nationals used to be on here actually. That's really random. But anyway, in this case, we're looking at keeping the knees forward. Now, how do we do that? We can do that in a couple of ways. You might even think that actually the weightlifting shoes might make this a little bit easier. If the knees are still being pushed forward, if we have that elevated heel, the knees will generally tend to be pushed forward. However, if we're not focusing on the knees staying forward, then we're obviously not going to be able to keep the leg drive engaged. So first of all, we need to start focusing on that. There is a variation some people use, which I don't love, which is a pause just off the floor in the initial rep. I prefer to keep the pause a little bit higher up. I think that messes up people's tempo just a little bit too much when we pause just above the floor. So I like to let the pause happen at the knee position. And so we're reinforcing the position we want, which is at the knee, which is delaying those knees coming back. So the knees need to come back a certain amount, obviously, to allow the barbell to get towards the lockout position, which is fine. But we need the knees to stay forward for a certain amount of time until the barbell reaches them, because we want to keep the leg drive going. So one of the first variations we could use is a pause at the knee. This again gives us that opportunity to focus on that position. A lot of times in this case though, we need to work a little bit harder on our leg strength and our quad strength. We could do this through the high bar back squat, which is why we often see that pushing your high bar squat will usually result in a deadlift PB shortly after. We could do some belt squats, we could do some heels elevated zombie front squats, and then we could also do some front foot elevated Bulgarian split squats. Any number of these variations or a combination of those to work directly on the leg strength, usually the high bar back squat is the winner here, will help with that leg drive. So the stronger our legs are and the more in tune with them we are, the better we'll be able to use that leg drive off the floor. So I bet a lot of your deadlifts look like this, and if that's the case, correct it. Now here we've got a really nice 240 kilo deadlift, which is, you might be wondering basically why are we looking at this if it's a nice deadlift. So by and large, I'm pretty happy with most of it. But what I would like to see him do is actually get a bit more aggressive off the floor. So he maintains these positions quite well. Would I like to head up slightly more? Yeah, just a little bit. But in general, he keeps the leg drive going. He keeps his back position. So it's I'm going to call that a flat back. And he uses a little bit of a dynamic start. But in general, most of the positions are good and I'm quite happy with that. One thing, small change I'd like to see is if we raise that head up a little bit more, we'd see the hips get a little bit closer to the barbell and he'd get a little bit of a closer drive. So that's one small change. But the main thing I'd like to see him do on top of that is actually get a bit more aggressive with that dynamic start. I'm a big fan of lifters using dynamic starts if we can hold a position. If we can use that stretch shortening cycle, which essentially allows you to produce more force over a shorter period of time or quicker, then if we can get stronger off the floor, you'll be able to potentially move more weight, because you can get the weight moving faster off the floor with more force. Then we can do the sport of powerlifting, which is just force lifting. If we can get that barbell, more force into it, theoretically we could lift more off the floor. However, that can come at the cost of positions. So if we can get a bit more of an aggressive dynamic start and keep our positions like we're doing here with that head up, I think we'd see a much better deadlift, or rather a better quality deadlift at those heavier weights. So I think he's actually a little bit too controlled. And the last thing we want to do in the deadlift is put more time under tension, make that barbell heavier in our hands for longer. So I'd like to see a more aggressive dynamic start. A single hip pump is quite good here. It doesn't have to be the most aggressive, elaborate dynamic start, but a more powerful dynamic start here is a good option, and I think it would benefit him really well. There's nothing wrong with training with slow off the floor once we're learning positions, and even if you get to heavier weights, that's fine. But after a while, I like people to start looking for that dynamic start and see if we can get it moving quite well, because it's really useful. Some people tend towards it quite naturally themselves, which is great, but some people never really think about it because they find it hard to hold positions. So it's a hard balance to get. If you start using that stretch shortening reflex in the start position, you will see that those heavier weights might fly up a little bit faster. Now lastly, we've got Ethan here. Now Ethan is doing a heavy clean deadlift, or rather in this case it's mostly a conventional deadlift. The major issue that we're seeing here is the too wide of a pulling stance. So in general, he's actually outside shoulder width for the most part with his feet. Usually we don't even want to be outside hip width for anyone deadlifting. Now, unless you're, 150 kilos plus, for the most part, you don't need to make your feet so wide that you need to allow room for your hips to sit in between your feet, essentially. For everyone else, under that 140, 130 kilo mark, the wider we stand, the less we're able to apply force efficiently into the ground with a conventional grip. Obviously, that's different with the sumo deadlift. We're able to apply a bit of a better force vector going up and down when we have that narrow grip. But the wider we start gripping and the wider we start standing, now not only for his weightlifting in this case, but also for heavy deadlifting, is the fact that we're not able to apply as much force into the ground as we possibly could when we have an outside hand width, when we have an outside foot grip, when we have that conventional grip. So in this case, what I'd be looking at is actually just bringing the feet in closer. This might feel good for his weightlifting, because if we have that wider stance, those knees are going to be a little bit further back, and as a result of that, then it might clear the knees a little bit easier. But what that often happens is we're a bit weaker off the floor. We end up landing narrower than our pulling position, which isn't something we want. But this is also a common issue we see with a lot of people's deadlifts, is the fact that when they're deadlifting, they will stand too wide. It's usually a newer lifter issue, a beginner lifter issue. So people say sub 180 kilos for the most part. Now I know he's doing 190 here, and I realize the irony of that, but let's say for people who are strength training or powerlifting, they will tend towards this wider stance because it'll feel just a little bit more comfortable. You'll feel like you're a little bit closer to the barbell. But if we're going for that wider stance with the conventional deadlift grip, we don't end up getting as good a quality position. So here we've got to be super conscious of the foot width.